People have lived along the banks of the River Nile since the very beginning of human history. In their struggle for survival, these early settlers faced a primeval world that was unpredictable and mysterious. Flowing 4,000 miles from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, the River Nile has shaped the lives and beliefs of many different races. Echoes of the ancient ways are still to be found in the highlands of Ethiopia, in the vast swamplands of Sudan, and in the fields of Egypt. The principal religions nowadays are Islam and Christianity, but both have borrowed and built upon earlier beliefs. It was here, in Egypt, more than 3,000 years before Christ, that the Nile gave rise to the world's first great civilization. The genius of the Egyptian is still seen today, and their ideas continue to inform our imagination. Egypt was the birthplace of Western man. Here he planted crops for the first time and turned the Nile into a Garden of Eden. The ancient Egyptians devised the first written language, carved it into stone, and celebrated their beliefs in monuments that would endure forever. Above all, they created a religion in which man and nature would exist in harmony for all eternity. In his quest to harness the forces of nature, man made nature his God. Out of the depths of prehistory, Egyptian civilization rose suddenly and apparently out of nothing. It had taken 1,000,000 years for man to go from primitive nomad to crop farmer, but just a few thousand to turn villages into great cities. Egyptians still build with mud bricks, and they make the bricks with the same wooden tools the ancients used. They continue to make a living from the land, irrigating their fields with water drawn from the Nile. Nearly 5,000 years ago, the Great Pyramids began to rise above the floodplain. But long before that, strips of riverside marsh had been transformed into productive farmland. Agriculture made wealth. Wealth made Egyptian civilization. These people were the pioneers of modern agriculture. They collected wild grasses from the riverbank and harvested the cereals we know today. If an ancient Egyptian were to stumble into this village, much would be familiar to him. Virtually everyone is involved in farming still, the women as much as the men. Domestic duties remain the same. Women still bake in clay ovens. Even their games date from pharaonic times. Villages beside the Nile are no longer isolated from the outside world. Farmers grow crops which they export to Europe, and many villages travel to the cities and work beyond. Cairo, capital of modern Egypt, was founded 1,000 years ago by a general who called it Al-Kahira, the city victorious. Its location has always been important. The pyramids were built nearby, and Cairo straddles the Nile at the point where the river broadens out into the delta. 15 million live here in Africa's most densely populated city. Even so, most people are emotionally tied to the traditions of the countryside. Adel El Abd is one of them. A merchant and landowner, he spends most of his time on his farm in the delta.
Most of my family live in Cairo. My brothers are engineers, doctors, and so on. But I always wanted to be a farmer. Since I was a young lad, I always wanted to be a farmer. And I think I accomplished what I wanted. The Nile Delta is not very vast, but it is the most fertile soil in Egypt. In the past, it was full of lakes, full of papyrus, and our ancestors and grandfathers reclaimed it and made it the most fertile piece of land, I think, on earth.
So fertile is the soil here that anyone who owns just a few acres can earn a decent living. Adel's family owns 50 acres, and he farms it with his manager, Mohammed. Their families have been working together since their grandfathers drained the land and first planted crops. Next door to Adel's farm, local villagers grow enough rice for their own needs. The reliance on communal labor to harvest crops recalls far earlier times. It was the surplus of grain that originally liberated the ancient Egyptians from subsistence farming and paved the way for pharaonic civilization. The Egyptians were among the most spectacular builders of all time, and the pyramids of Giza, the largest stone structures ever built. There's a popular myth that the monuments of the pharaohs were built by slaves. But the truth is that the hard labor was the work of off-season farmers, driven from the land by the annual floods and eager to earn a living during the 3 months when their fields lay underwater. What made all this possible was the mud of the Nile.
This black earth is actually what made this Egypt and what made this farm most prosperous. This black earth is the magic of Egypt. They say Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Look at the sediments here, full of iron, zinc, manganese, everything that any plant can need. It's a miracle. The Nile every year brings us a miracle.
It's a miracle that has its origins 4,000 miles upstream at the start of the longest river in the world. In fact, there are 2 Niles. The Blue Nile rises in the highlands of Ethiopia, and the White Nile above Lake Victoria in Central Africa. The ancient Egyptians attributed the annual floods to the god Hapi.
Hail to you, Hapi, sprung from the earth, come to nourish Egypt, who floods the fields that Ra has made, to nourish all who thirst.
While the Blue Nile provided the great bulk of mud and water that reached Egypt, the White Nile yielded up the gift of Hapi, the rich soup of nutrients that made Egypt's soil so fertile. Deep in tropical Africa, the Nile Valley appears precisely as it must have in Egypt at the time of the first pharaohs. Here the Nile is rich in wildlife, and we know from early art that most of the creatures we see in these swamps were familiar to the ancient Egyptians. A combination of climatic change and hunting pressure drove many animals out of Egypt thousands of years ago. One of the first casualties was the elephant. Sometime during the earliest dynasties, nearly 5,000 years ago, the elephant, the giraffe, and the rhinoceros all disappeared from Egypt. But even as the elephant was in retreat, Egyptians were forging a religion out of nature. The hippopotamus, surprisingly, was one of many creatures they made into a god. Voluptuous and motherly, the female came to represent Tauret, goddess of childbirth. But the hippo was also a scourge who raided fields at night. The male became Seth, god of chaos. The climate of ancient Egypt was far wetter than today. Away from the Nile, the savanna supported big cats and large herds. Because of its ability to see beyond the horizon, the giraffe came to symbolize foresight to the Egyptians. Trying to cope with and understand a world filled with animals that both supported and preyed on mankind, the ancients evolved a mythology and religion that tried to make sense of it all. Man's yearning to impose order on the natural world can be seen on this 5,000-year-old flint knife. Its ivory handle carved with the creatures that animated his world and his dreams. Surviving knife handles depict more than 40 species. To catalog the world in this way meant to control it. But one animal dominated man's imagination. To the early Egyptians, the lion was king, and the king was lion. Carvings from 3500 BC show the king as a ferocious lion devouring his enemies. Lassos, spears, traps, and bow and arrow were all part of an increasingly sophisticated armory. Not that this made the world free of danger. The African buffalo probably killed as many people as the big cats. As a result, the buffalo was a symbol of aggressive, naked power. That's how King Narmer, the first pharaoh, is depicted on a ceremonial carving. The narrative tells of the emergence of the world's first nation-state. Presiding over it is a godlike creature, part cow, part buffalo. Narmer, king of Upper Egypt, is a buffalo, crushing the walls of a recalcitrant delta city and trampling the enemy underfoot. This is one of the most important documents in Egyptian history. It proclaims kingship as the form of government, and in the use of animal symbols and hieroglyphs, it establishes a code of expression which will last for 3,500 years. Horus, the falcon god, and another symbol for the king, presides over the papyrus lands of the captured delta. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt into a state that's lasted till today is celebrated by the intertwining heads of two mythic beasts. The ascent of Egypt from a collection of nomadic herders into a settled kingdom was the direct result of climate and geography. Here was a land of perpetual sunshine and rich soil, and the Egyptians did their utmost to turn it into an earthly paradise. Not that the spoils were evenly shared. A few led lives of luxury, but most Egyptians were grindingly poor. All the same, even the poor would benefit from date palms, a source of sugar, wine, and medication since early times. Dates, figs, down palms, and many other fruit trees lined the riverbank. Some were native to Egypt, many others were brought from distant lands. The Nile provided an abundance of food. Fish were plentiful, and the marshes teemed with ducks and geese. As if this weren't enough, traders from the rest of the continent brought a constant supply of exotic goods down the Nile. Gold, ivory, ebony, incense, and furs from tropical Africa. It was a land of plenty. That it should prosper came as naturally as these sugary dates from the trees. Sometimes it feels as though nothing has changed.
The links between the present Egyptian farmer and the pharaonic Egyptian farmer are still very, very strong. For example, the Nokta is still the decisive day for picking, harvesting, ripening the fruits, etc., which was a pharaohic calendar. And the Nokta is actually the first arrival of the flood water to Egypt. And up till now, the Egyptian farmer considered that date a sacred day.
It was the sacred ibis that heralded the life-giving floods. Forced downstream by the advancing water, they arrived at the height of summer. Farmers saw these birds as allies. They ate the locusts that ravaged their crops. They also fed on exposed crocodile eggs. With its beak dipping into the earth like a scribe's brush into black ink, the ibis came to symbolize knowledge. And knowledge, to most ancient Egyptians, meant a dependable foretelling of the water's return. All Egypt waited, in anticipation of an infusion from this artery of life. 2,000 miles upriver from the Nile Delta, the Ethiopian highlands. Over millions of years, the high plateau has been eroded away and washed downstream to become the rich mud of the Nile Valley. Every spring, the monsoon rains saturate the land and swell the rivers. The mud-laden water is now at its highest level. Tissisat Falls, at the head of the Blue Nile, is in full flood. Four-fifths of the water that flows into Egypt comes from here. Eventually, the muddy water of the Blue Nile joins the nutrient-rich waters of the White Nile. Together they flow into Egypt, and the river slows to a more leisurely pace, depositing its silt along the way. Today, the river is controlled by a series of dams, and most mud settles out before entering Egypt, leaving the water blue. Until 100 years ago, the floods at their heights filled the entire valley, forcing wildlife and people onto higher ground. Every year, the god Hapi ensured the bounty, covering the entire floodplain, willing it once again into life. After a few months, the waters receded, leaving a feast in their wake. Great naturalists that they were, the Egyptians recorded what they saw in minute detail. In the early tomb paintings at Maidum, a procession of white-fronted and red-breasted geese brought the marshlands to life. But no creature was better equipped to harvest the marshes than the sacred ibis. Its long, curved bill probed deep into the mud, catching the most elusive of prey. Its cleverness became enshrined as Thoth, god of wisdom. The bird still lives on the walls of countless temples, guiding the brushstrokes of the scribe. Here he presides at the tree of life, painting the name of a pharaoh onto a leaf. Until he does so, the pharaoh does not exist. Such is the power of words. The great surprise of Egyptian art is the almost scientific attention to detail. The hoopoe, its crest on display. The purple gallinule skulking in the lilies. The pied kingfisher hovering above the river. Far from being stylized and abstract, Egyptian art is often infused with fleeting moments of nature. The quest was to capture nature in such a dependable way that the creatures would accompany the dead into the afterlife. Nowhere were the floods more eagerly awaited than at Aswan. Here, Egyptians first measured the annual rise of the river using a device called a Nileometer. In an ideal year, the flood would rise 27 feet above its winter level. 3 feet higher, and the water destroys villages. 3 feet lower, and people starve. Until the dams were built, this gauge in modern Arabic was used to measure the floods. Alongside it, a much older measure from Pharaonic times. Measuring water is one thing. Being clever with it is quite another. The first irrigation canals were built before the pharaohs, but the invention of the shaduf revolutionized farming. With its bucket at one end and mud weight at the other, the shaduf led to a dramatic increase in irrigated land. Around 300 BC, Greek invaders introduced the sakia, an animal-driven water wheel capable of lifting a continuous flow. Better management of water meant that more and more land could be brought under the plow. So efficient are these ancient lifting devices that their design has not changed for 2,000 years. The only difference with Adel's water wheel is that it is driven by a diesel engine rather than ox power.
It was introduced to Egypt 2,000 years ago by the Romans and is still an incredible piece of equipment for irrigation. It gets the water from low levels. It upraises it up to any level you want.
Once every 12 years, Adel's water wheel must be replaced. It's almost identical to its Roman original. The link between technology and economics is clear. New farming systems worked so well that the Romans had to build scores of granaries to hold the increased harvest. Devices such as these helped them turn Egypt into the breadbasket of the empire. So vast were the surpluses of grain that taxes in Rome could be reduced by 2/3. Egypt, the gift of the Nile, became the lifeline of Rome. The Egyptians built their civilization with the wealth generated by grain. In addition to barley, they grew several other cereals they used to make bread and beer. The land grew more than just food. Flax was harvested and woven into fine linen that made light, airy garments. But for the pharaohs, what mattered most was the harvest of grain. Each year, an army of bureaucrats measured the farmers' fields. So dependable and constant was the harvest that a simple taxation system was devised. It linked the size of each field to the height of the annual flood, measured at the Nileometer. This gave the overseers of the fields an estimate of what should be taxed. Farmers also paid tax on their cattle. Carved models from an aristocrat's tomb depict a cattle count on a large estate. Farmers drive their herds past the beady eyes of the tax inspector. Stamping mud into potter's clay is one of the oldest activities in Egypt. It's impossible to overstate the importance of mud to the Nile story. It's agriculture, but it's also history.
Allah, 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 Allah.
As long ago as 5000 BC, mud was molded into pots that were used to store and transport grain, oil, and wine. Today, Egyptians still put pots to a whole variety of uses, and most villages have their own potter. Much of what we know of pre-pharaonic times comes from pottery unearthed in burial sites. The shapes, glazes, and illustrations they used help us to date events in ancient Egypt very precisely. 5,000 years ago, pots like this were filled with provisions that accompanied the dead into the afterlife. They were carefully decorated with animals and gods. One of the earliest images is woman as cow goddess, arms raised like cattle horns. The Ankoli cattle of the Upper Nile closely resemble the ones associated with the cow goddess. The idea of the divine cow wasn't confined to the Nile Valley, but it has persisted here till the present day. Midway between the highlands of Ethiopia and Lake Victoria, a vast papyrus swamp straddles the White Nile. Arab traders called it the Sud, or the obstacle. This is the largest swamp on Earth, and it forms an almost impenetrable barrier between tropical Africa and Egypt. The Sud is home to the Nuer, a people whose lives are entirely devoted to cattle. Without the Nuer, cattle could not survive here, and without cattle, neither could the Nuer. Anuk's routine seldom alters, and at dawn each day, she lights a fire of cattle dung. Nuer have no permanent home. When the Nile floods, they retreat with their cattle to higher ground. When the waters recede, they move back to the heart of the swamps. Their lives, like those of the ancient Egyptians, ebb and flow with the rhythms of the Nile. The Nuer could scarcely have chosen a harsher place to live. The crocodiles here are killers, but the Nuer's main enemies are insects. The Sud is infested with the malaria mosquito and tsetse fly. Insects dictate the morning duties of the Nuer women.
We put ash on the cows, which keeps the tsetse fly away. The smoke also drives them off. Once we've milked the cows, they go off to graze. Then we collect dung and dry it to make fires.
Cattle supply almost all the material needs of the Nuer. Dried dung is used for cooking. Its ash is even used to make toothpaste. The Nuer couldn't possibly live closer to their cows. There must have been the same intimacy with animals in ancient Egypt. Nuer women take care of everything to do with growing and preparing grain. Millet and wheat are staple foods here, just as they were in Pharaonic times. This has been women's work since time immemorial, and it's as tough a job today as it was then. Women also take charge of all the dairy work.
When the cows come in from grazing, it's the women's role to milk them and turn the milk into butter.
From a very early age, girls are taught how to milk. A striking tenderness exists between a Nuer girl and her cows. Nothing has changed. Since Egyptian times, calves have been tethered to their mother's front legs. The calabash remains the ideal receptacle for milk. To cattle-loving people, cows have real feelings. They even recognize the sadness a cow feels at having to give up some of the milk that nature intended for its calf. Cattle also dominate the thoughts and conversations of newer boys. When they reach manhood, cows will provide them with a currency to acquire a bride. In newer society, social standing is a reflection of the number of cows you own. Among the Nuer, the status of cattle is preordained by God, as the tribal elder Gach tells his people.
Both man and cow needed each other. After man was created, he was told to go out into the world, and the cow was told to follow him. God gave the orders. He is the creator. He told us that we mustn't kill cows as they are his creation. You can kill them only if you're starving.
In late morning, Nuer boys accompany the herds out to pasture. They will spend the day with them, watching them, talking to them, treating them as equals. On sacred occasions, the village elders say, it's entirely proper to offer up an animal. Cows are sacrificed at weddings or when young men go into the bush on a journey of initiation. The slaughter of a cow is never lightly undertaken. The Nuer always explain to God why they are killing an animal, and they are careful to tell each animal just why it must be sacrificed. The Egyptians' intense love of cattle was captured in their language. Human beings were referred to as cattle of the sun god. The cow goddess Hathor was the symbolic mother of the pharaoh. Egypt's leaders were suckled on her divine milk and she protected both the pharaohs and their royal cemeteries beside the Nile. When the Greeks arrived, they immediately recognized Hathor as their own Aphrodite. Later, among the Romans, she became Venus, and temples continued to be built in her honor. Egyptians often made offerings to Hathor and worshipped her in many guises. They worshipped the cow goddess long before the first pharaoh, and continued to worship her long after the last.
عندك يا محمد جوه هناك بقى هات بالة تبن ودخلها هناك.
In most places today, cattle are straightforward providers of milk and meat. Nothing divine about them. Egyptians, however, are still an intensely religious people. Hathor is no longer an influence, but the Nile continues to govern their spiritual values.
The Greek historian Herodotus, 2,500 years ago, said the Egyptians are most religious of all people. And it's because of the Nile that every year we have to wait whether it's going to be flood. If it's high, it's a catastrophe. It's low, it's another catastrophe. By nature, we are religious, and we have to be close to God and improve ourselves and our souls.
In the old city of Cairo, there's a mosque on almost every corner. For the last 1,000 years, Cairo has been a great center of Islamic culture and scholarship. There are over 50 million Muslims in Egypt today, but there is also a sizable population of some 7 million Christians. Most are members of the Coptic Church. Before the Islamic conquest of the 7th century, most Egyptians were Coptic Christians. The church's patriarch, Pope Shenouda, believes that some Coptic ideas are rooted in the oldest traditions.
Till now, we pray in our churches for the Nile, that God may raise its water to its measure, not to be more, not to be less, because we cannot separate ourselves from the nature of the universe in which we are living. We also pray in our church for the plants, for all creatures. We pray also for the winds, for the air.
Ancient Egyptians believed in a universe animated by gods and men. Protected by the arching form of the sky goddess Nut, they were shielded from the forces of chaos beyond. Below, on the Nile Valley floor, the earth god, Geb, bathed in eternal sunlight.
They worshipped the energy of God, not God himself. They worshipped the power of God. They discovered this power in the sun, in the water, in the Nile. So they worshipped the river Nile and the sun.
The sun was the supreme deity, the source of life for gods and men. Every dawn was a reenactment of the original moment of creation, when all deferred to the sun as it journeyed into the heavens. Above the river, on the valley cliffs, barking baboons herald the new day. Ancient Egyptians may have noticed that the hierarchy of the baboon troop mirrored their own society, with the dominant male assuming the role of pharaoh, and select females that of the royal harem. The preeminence of the sun is portrayed on the walls of countless tombs. The sun is held aloft by the falcon god Horus. A baboon raises his hands in adoration. The lion is a key solar creature, often portrayed as the protector of the sun. Men and women bow down with the animals around them. All acknowledge the life-giving power of the sun. On temples, baboons stand at attention in its honor. The crocodile Sobek supports the sun, and in turn is protected by the open wings of Horus, the falcon god. At dawn, vultures spread their wings to soak up the sun's heat and prepare themselves for flight. To the Egyptians, this spreading of wings was an act of prayer. All life in the valley took place beneath the protective wings of the goddess Mehbet. The vulture entered the hieroglyphic language as the word Mut, which means mother. Crocodiles were once found along the whole length of the Nile. Over 20 feet in length, they were stealthy killers. With gaping mouths, they paid their dues to the sun, but this posture was also perceived as a symbol of aggression. Because of this, crocodiles were associated with Seth, the god of chaos, an enemy of Horus. Crocodiles were also accorded high status as protectors of the pharaoh. Holding the sign of life, the crocodile god Sobek stands as defender of the great pharaoh, Amenhotep. Images of nature also infuse every aspect of temple architecture. Twin pylons represent the high cliffs that enclose the Nile Valley. The river between these stylized cliffs becomes the means of entry into the inner spiritual world. Temples glorify the animals of the river, transforming them into gods. But nature was mimicked as well as idolized. These temple columns suggest a stand of papyrus reeds. No creature is too insignificant. Everything under the sun has a place in this religion, and its art. Egyptian architecture expresses the underlying patterns of life, the geometry of growth and fruition. Seed pods and fresh shoots of new growth are signs of nature's renewal. Presiding over all life on the river was Osiris, the green-faced god of fertility. With his shepherd's crook and grain flail, Osiris answered the prayers of both herdsmen and farmers. "Thou art the Nile," said the Pharaoh Ramses in his hymn to Osiris. "Gods and men live from thy outflow." In ancient times, the Nile broke into 5 separate rivers when it entered the delta, and between the rivers lay great expanses of papyrus swamp. So important was the papyrus that it became an emblem of Lower Egypt. Here, near the source of the Blue Nile, the task of gathering papyrus is fraught with danger. As they approach in their flimsy papyrus canoes, the men make as much noise as possible to scare away hippos, crocodiles, and snakes. Papyrus is a marsh reed that grows to a height of 15 feet. Its stalks are riddled with air chambers, and this makes it unusually buoyant and ideal for boats. In ancient Egypt, papyrus meant far more than transport. It was the vehicle for the transmission of language and ideas. By beating papyrus into flat strips and pressing them together, Egyptians made the first paper. The dangers of the river were often recorded with wry humor. The Egyptians made the earliest comic strips, and scrolls could stretch over 100 feet long. In Egypt, the scribe was part bureaucrat, part priest. His work allowed a great nation to be unified. He chronicled its history, preserved its myths, and ensured government efficiency. For the pharaohs, information was power. What gave the scribe his power was the language of hieroglyphs. The hieroglyphic text derived many of its images from nature. As the language evolved, animals became dissociated from nature and simply came to represent sounds and letters. The horns of the cow god holding the sun disk became the sign for the sound whoop. This leap, from nature to symbol to sound, is at the heart of all future writing. The Nile still supports a great array of races and cultures. Nobody lives closer to the river than the Nuer. When the annual floodwaters recede, the Nuer return with their cattle to the river's edge. Once the flood damage has been repaired, the women take great pride in looking after their huts. As in so many African societies, women bear a heavy responsibility. They ensure continuity of the family line and the survival of tribal culture. In addition to their duties in looking after the cattle, women must be mothers, wives, and homemakers. For the Nuer, it's the simple things that matter most: birth, death, and marriage. Anuk has 4 daughters. Like all Nuer girls, they will marry in their early teens. This elaborately decorated patio seat announces the girls' availability. The most common decorative motif is a wavy pattern reminiscent of a flowing river. Not surprisingly, this is just the way the Egyptians depicted the Nile. It's also similar to the hieroglyph for water. Mud is also shaped into cones that top every Nuer roof. Each is a kind of coat of arms, a family totem. In adult life, these boys will build real villages, repairing each year the damage done by the floods. Their sisters have their own preoccupations. They remove their waistbands, a sign of virginity, and place them on models of their future homes. Soon, these girls will be seeking husbands and bearing children. The women of ancient Egypt were renowned for their beauty, and much of the poetry is about courtship.
How delightful, my beloved, to go down with you to the river. I look forward to the moment when you will ask me to bathe before your eyes.
An Egyptian village is a large, extended family, and virtually everybody is related to everybody else. The children may not know what jobs they'll have when they grow up, but many already know who they'll marry. As in ancient Egypt, most girls get married at an early age.
وبيرسموا واحنا بعد كده قدرنا نشوف ايه الحاجات اللي هم كانوا بيعملوها.
Hanan is 16, and today is her wedding day. This is the last time she'll carry out her domestic duties at the home of her parents. Though not exactly apprehensive, She knows her life will be very different.
I know that once I'm married, everything will change. When you become a housewife, it's very different from being a young girl. Till now, I've done as I please. But in my husband's house, I'll have to ask his permission to do certain things. And if he says no, that's it.
Hanan is one of 13 children. For her mother, Qaidi, it's been a continual struggle to feed and clothe the family. It's a familiar story in the villages along the Nile, and if Qaidi has one hope, it's that her daughter will be more fortunate than she was.
I wish her every happiness and hope she'll bring her husband much prosperity. I don't want her to be like me. I've had too many children and I've suffered a lot. If she has just 2 children, she'll be able to feed them and send them to school.
In ancient Egypt, a wedding was described as founding a house. Before the festivities, Qaidi inspects her daughter's new home. The groom's mother greets her at the door.
This is the hall leading to the sitting room. This is the sitting room, and we'll have curtains here and here. And the entrance will be here. Here we come to the salon. Here there will also be curtains, and there will be carpets on the floor. This is all ours, to the horizon. These cattle are ours. The buffalo and donkeys are ours too. All this is ours.
To the ancient Egyptians, monogamous marriage was part of the divine order. Here, the dwarf tailor Seneb is presented in a family group. His children are depicted with their fingers to their lips, the traditional sign of childhood. Egyptian sculptors celebrated the tenderness between man and wife. By the day of the wedding, Hanan and her mother will have spent the dowry. Hanan's eldest brother, Qaidi, must now reassure the groom's family that the dowry has been sensibly spent. Hanan's husband-to-be, Ahmed, looks on as Qaidi signs a document listing the young couple's new possessions. Once the contract has been signed, the couple's dowry furniture, together with gifts from family and friends, is paraded through the village. Everyday events like this shape the ancient Egyptians' vision of the afterlife. Just as the young couple take their furniture into their new home, their pharaonic ancestors took their everyday possessions into their tombs when they died. Egyptians have always idealized feminine beauty. Servants primp the waxed wig of a queen as she takes her breakfast, but women of all classes wore jewelry and makeup. Among the most ancient customs is the henna-ing of hands, and at a wedding this is made into a special ceremony. While gold, silver, and rare gems were imported from the Near East, eye makeup like kohl came from as far away as Ethiopia.
Love your wife ardently, feed her and clothe her. Fragrant unguents are good for her body. Make her happy all her days, for she is like the field that brings benefit to its owner.
At Hanan's wedding, everyone's contribution is acknowledged, and Kaidi reads out a list of gifts and givers for all to hear. For the ancient Egyptians, marriage was literally for all time. Just as their friends wished them a long and prosperous life on earth, they also hoped and believed their happiness together would continue in life after death. The timelessness of marriage has been captured for all time in the figures of Rahotep and Nofret, two courtiers who lived around 2600 BC at the dawn of Egypt's greatest era. By the time the Romans overran Egypt in 30 BC, the pharaonic world had begun to crumble. Two giant statues, the Colossi of Memnon, are all that remain of a once great temple. During the 1,000 years before Christ, the Egyptians suffered many invasions. Although their belief system remained intact, the invaders came to exploit the country as well as to marvel at its culture. The temple behind the Colossi was destroyed by an earthquake. Now the newcomers made their own mark. One Roman emperor carved his name on the stone, and casual vandalism has continued from that day on. The Romans conquered Egypt because they wanted her grain. But Egypt was also the gateway to Africa, to a world teeming with wild animals. In amphitheaters throughout the empire, vast numbers of animals were slaughtered for the entertainment of the masses. "5,000 wild animals were killed on the day the Colosseum opened in Rome. During the rule of Nero, the Praetorian Guard slaughtered 400 bears and 300 lions in a single day. Christians and criminals were fed to wild cats. Slaves were forced to kill slaves. Animals were captured far beyond the frontiers of the empire. The Egyptians had deified nature. The Romans enslaved it. No creature was safe. The waters still tumble over the falls at Tisisat, but the mountain elephants have long gone. It wasn't just hunting that drove them to extinction, but the loss of their forest home. Nearby on Lake Tana, Papyrus boats enable the woodcutters to exploit the remotest shores. Virtually everyone in Ethiopia cooks with wood, but there's also a heavy demand for building timber. Today, there are 50 million Ethiopians, 3 times as many as in 1950, and the vast majority live off the land. Every year, more forest is felled to satisfy their needs, and all but a tenth of the original forest has now disappeared. This is eucalyptus. In many areas, it's the only fuel available for cooking. Eucalyptus is a fast-growing tree that has been planted to replace the native forest. It's also a menace. With its thirst for water, it breaks up the soil and causes serious erosion. All that's left of the native forest here is a single acacia tree. The surrounding eucalyptus supports little wildlife. Over much of the highlands, forests have been cleared. After the rains, the fields look lush and green. But with no trees to bind the soil, the land is raked by summer winds, and huge volumes of topsoil are washed into the rivers. Scattered around the Ethiopian highlands, however, are small oases where nature survives. The monastery of Debre Libanos is surrounded by its own Garden of Eden. Ancient Christian traditions are saving wildlife from extinction. The gelada baboon used to be common throughout Ethiopia. Now it's very rare and can only be found in isolated forests like these. Pilgrimage is as important now as it was in medieval times, and on festival days, farmers head for the monasteries. Christianity arrived here in the 4th century. Since then, highland Ethiopia has been predominantly Christian, and the traditions we see today are those of the early church. They still use the sistrum, an instrument played by priests in the temples of ancient Egypt. Ethiopians were long part of a ribbon of Christianity that ran along the Nile from Alexandria in Egypt to the highland headwaters. The churches of Egypt and Ethiopia are linked by common beliefs and centuries of isolation from mainstream European Christianity. Both churches have a powerful monastic tradition, and their spiritual leaders always come from the monasteries. Today's church leader, Paulus V, stands at the end of a long line of Ethiopian patriarchs.
The spiritual life in Ethiopia as a whole is very strong. The monastic life is quite a large number throughout the country, because there are about 1,000 monasteries from the ancient times.
Among the most ancient monasteries are those on the islands of Lake Tana, source of the Blue Nile. Like Debre Libanos, These islands are thick with native forest. Monastic retreats have always been nature reserves. Ethiopian monasteries, like their European counterparts, are great centers of learning and Christianity. In times of turmoil, monks kept alive all the ideas that meant civilization, not just religion, but also history and literature. This parchment Bible is illuminated with the stories that sustain faith. It could well have been produced by monks in the 8th century. The story of the passion and death of Jesus Christ. The material world holds little attraction for monks. Theirs is a life of prayer, poverty, and obedience. Living in sanctuaries of devotion, isolated from the distractions of the outside world, Orthodox tradition dictates that man will find God by contemplating nature. As well as being libraries, monasteries are also nature reserves. For the monks, nature is the other book through which God speaks. Today, these islands are important breeding sites. They are also critical winter habitat for many migrating birds. Respect for bird life is shared by all Ethiopian highlanders. Deep-seated religious traditions derive from Old Testament laws against eating ibis, herons, storks, and web-footed birds. Dietary prohibitions have effectively conserved an astounding 96% of the country's 830 bird species. Even during the famines of recent decades, the birds on Lake Tana were left in peace. To live in harmony with nature is to be close to God. Every monk strives to find himself inside nature's web of life. These men lived by rules laid down in Egypt in the 4th century, the same rules that would later govern monastic life in medieval Europe. Monks themselves do everything necessary to run the monastery. This simple way of life allows them to concentrate on their devotions to God.
No one complains what kind of obligation is assigned to him. This is just an absolute submission of all members. So they do whatever is being asked and required from them. Then they live together. They eat once a day, very minimal and simple food.
The food may be simple, but for young novices, monasteries provide the security their peasant families have never known. Here, they will always be fed and cared for. At Debre Libanos, the life of communal prayer and contemplation continues far into the night. These ancient hymns and psalms have echoed unchanged through the centuries. For some monks, however, life in the monastery is not austere enough. They set themselves apart to live in solitude.
There are people who think even this kind of a very strict communal life is too luxurious for them. So they prefer to isolate themselves from the community. And they make very small contacts for the sake of survival, in order to somebody to offer them a glass of water or a handful of beans or something.
Father Atello came to Debre Libanos as a child. He's been living alone in a cave above the monastery for 30 years. He even avoids contact with the novice who brings his meager meals. When Father Atello first became a hermit, he vowed not to eat, but became too weak to pray. A rigorous routine of prayer dominates his daily life.
When you plant a tree, it's like giving birth to a child. We are monks without hope or desire of producing offspring. Planting trees brings reward and grace from God. Green plants symbolize virtuous qualities like innocence, kindness, and fertility. As for the wild animals, be they baboons or monkeys, they are playful and friendly, and we enjoy passing time with them. Wild animals are obedient and pleasing to God.
The people who live a monastic and spiritual life, they simply care for everything. Even for the trees, even for the stones to be broken into two pieces. They would mind to do that.
Monks are heirs to a long tradition of caring for nature. In Africa, it extends back beyond the pharaohs. In Europe, to St. Francis of Assisi. In Ethiopia, monasteries are a last oasis of hope for much of the country's beleaguered wildlife. Immediately north of Lake Tana is the ancient city of Gondor, former capital of Ethiopia. Its castle was built at a time of great spiritual fervor. It's an emotion that can still be felt today at the annual festival of Timkat, a reenactment of the immersion of Christ by John the Baptist. Timkat celebrates the sanctity of water, and it starts with a parade of the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark is among the holiest of images in Ethiopia. In it, God gave Moses the 10 Commandments. Every year, replicas of all the arks from all the churches are carried on the heads of priests to a pool of Nile water. Just as Christ was baptized in the River Jordan, so the people of Gondor are rebaptized every year in the headwaters of the Nile. Monks dressed in medieval vestments come from all over to take part in this annual festival of spiritual renewal. The ceremony begins with a candlelit crucifix set adrift on the waters. In a reversal of the original baptism, it is the innocent, the children, who baptize the adults, splashing them with holy water. The day is a festival of baptism. For Pope Shenouda, it's deeply linked with the religion of the pharaohs.
They worshipped the Nile as the source of life. We know quite well in the Bible that water is a source of life. And our Lord Jesus Christ spoke about the living water, giving life to others.
But water can be as good for the body as it is for the soul. Near the source of the Nile, whole families gather, drawn to the enduring presence and energy of the river. Here they pray for their sick, their halt, and their lame. These are festive occasions. They break bread, drink coffee, and pray. Chants fill the air, summoning up healing spirits. Offerings are made to the gods of the Nile. It's a powerful invocation combining fire and water and blood. Cairo has long been one of the great cities of Islamic learning and art. Sultan Hassan, one of the greatest mosques, was built in the 13th century. Even here, it's hard not to notice influences from ancient Egypt. To enter a mosque is to enter into God's presence. There's more than a hint of the past here. Daily devotions that acknowledge the rising of the sun. Abstract designs based on nature. The banded entryway to eternal life. As an Egyptian, Adel El-Ebt is aware of his rich heritage.
I'm a Muslim, and I cannot be Muslim till I believe in all prophets from Adam, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We have to believe in all of them and respect them and study them and be good to everybody, whether he's Muslim, Christian, or Jews. You have to respect them. You cannot be a Muslim without respecting the other religions. And it is stated clearly in the Quran that we have to believe in all other religions and prophets and respect them and don't differentiate between either one.
Islam and Christianity stand near the end of the great river of time that is the Nile. But all faiths have always prayed for eternal life and have believed that the way you live this life will determine your status in the next. It's an idea that descends to us little modified since the time of the pharaohs. Countless tomb paintings show funeral processions, with professional wailers weeping for the spirit of the departed. Tombs were filled with everything the dead might be expected to need in the afterlife. Even down to their sandals. Vast numbers of mummified animal gods were also placed in the tombs. This man was buried 6,000 years ago, on the edge of the desert where his body was naturally mummified by the drying sands. Even at that time, people were buried facing the setting sun and provided with food and images for the afterlife. The tradition of preparing for eternity was so strong that by early Pharaonic times, realistic sculptures were placed in tombs, waiting to be inhabited by the spirits of the dead. Glass eyes enabled the dead to gaze out on a new life. Monumental tombs ensured not only the afterlife of the pharaoh, but also, through his survival, the spirits of all his people. For the Egyptians, the most terrifying thing in the world was the idea of oblivion, that they would fail the tests that gave them entry into the underworld. The passage they hoped to make from death to eternity is recorded in the books of the dead. In the opening of the mouth ceremony, they recite spells over the mummy to restore the powers of life, especially sight and speech, which the spirit will need on the journey ahead. Now the spirit must pass through 28 gates. But to get beyond the guardian gods of the underworld, every spell, every invocation must be word perfect. Here the royal scribe Ani sets off on his journey, accompanied by his wife Tutu.
Make a way for me, for I know you. I know your name, and I know the name of the god who guards you. Mistress of the Sky is her name.
After satisfying each guardian god, he passes through to the next gate, and the journey continues. He is guided by the jackal god Anubis into the house of the two truths to face the ultimate test, where his spirit will either be cast into the hell of oblivion or enter into paradise. Paraded before a jury of gods, to each in turn he declares his innocence.
I have not robbed, nor done violence to any man. I have not caused pain. I have not made suffering for anyone. O blood-eater who came forth from the shambles, I have not killed a sacred bull. I have not trapped birds in the preserves of the gods. I have not caught the fish of their marshland. I have not diverted water at its season. I have not built a dam on flowing waters. I have not fouled the waters.
As confirmation that the dead is telling the truth, his heart is weighed against a feather on the scales of justice. The beast Amut stands ready to devour any hearts laden with sin. Thoth, the god of wisdom, declares the dead person to be true of voice. He is then led to meet Osiris, the god of the underworld, who ushers him into paradise. Out of the mud and water of the Nile, the ancient Egyptians created a paradise on earth. In their imagination, it could not be bettered, and they took the best of it with them to the next world. For 5,000 years, the pharaohs have gazed across the land of Egypt, pleased with what they saw. Plainly, the view has changed. The industrial present has arrived, but it still exists side by side with an agricultural past. More and more people are leaving the countryside and flooding into the cities. In the modern world, men and women live far from nature, far from the world that shaped the beliefs of ancient Egypt. Nevertheless, thoughts of an earthly paradise persist. All societies, all religions across the ages aspire to return to a Garden of Eden. It's a place that lives on in our imagination and can still be found along the headwaters of the Nile. Our ends are in our beginnings, the poet Eliot once said. And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. What we find along the Nile today is an old idea that has a new resonance. At the core of Egyptian religion lies the belief that men and animals should live in harmony, and that mankind has a responsibility to ensure that all this continues. It's an idea that persists, shimmers in the memory of an ancient time when the Nile was the river of gods.